Good afternoon, and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday program. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis. Today, we are very fortunate to host Marc Frank after a little bit of a mishap a couple of weeks ago when we couldn't have the program because of the grid being down in Havana. So we had to postpone due to those outages, but hopefully we will have smooth sailing today. But of course, there are no guarantees. Marc Frank is a journalist who writes for Reuters and the Financial Times. He has penned an excellent book, which I'm going to show you, called Cuban Revelations: Behind the Scenes in Havana. This is one of the most authoritative and readable books on Cuba. He writes about the historical context for the revolution and examines the social, political, and economic issues that have shaped Cuba today. So for 60 years, the U.S. embargo, recent hurricanes, blackouts, and shortages have all left their mark on Cuba. And since Marc Frank has spent more than 30 years in the country, he is in really the ideal position to explain what is happening today. He has spoken on previous Praxis programs, and we met him when he was a lecturer on the Praxis trips to Cuba in 2015 and 2016. So he warned me that there might be a blackout today, and if there is, we can always reschedule, but hopefully we're going to get through it without any problems. So welcome, Marc. It's great to have you back with us.
Yeah, I was blacked out all day, so I don't think they're going to bother me tonight. So I should be fine.
But we don't want you blacked out now. So I want to start with a question about what is happening right now in Cuba. I know the power grids have been on and off. There have been a lot of energy interruptions in Havana and generally in the country. How are people coping, and what is it like right now?
Well, I mean, it's it's a process. It's what's happened now is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. So a couple times over the last month, the power grid completely failed, right? Once on its own, and once during a hurricane. And both those, kind of shone the light on what's been going on for a long time now in Cuba, for the last 3 years at least, outside of Havana, there's been a serious power crisis with people going without lights for hours and hours and hours, 12, 15 hours a day, many times. And this year in general, it got worse, and now it's kind of climaxed with these power outages and with a very high power deficit, which continues to this day. So the crisis has kind of moved from the countryside, where there's been these long blackouts, to Havana, which has been pretty much protected during the last 3 years. And so now we're kind of feeling what everybody else has been going through for the last 3 years. And there's two basic reasons for it. One is, in general, the age and deterioration of the power of the infrastructure that exists. It's all fossil fuel fired, and it's very old. And two, the lack of fuel, because fuel is largely imported in Cuba, and it's been harder and harder for them to be able to purchase it on the international market, or to make deals where they trade it for doctors or whatever goes on. So those two things have kind of come together to really create a very serious situation right now in Cuba. When the power fails in Cuba, the water pumps fail, and very often the communications fail, because, in the end, electricity is everything, and you can't do much without electricity. And and so what happens is, for example, this year, which has been particularly bad, it's clear now the economy is going to, decline 3 to 5%, simply in large part because of the problems with electricity. And basically what happens with blackouts, I remember, I went through it during the special period after the Soviets fell. It disrupts everything. And when you have these long blackouts on a daily basis, daily life changes dramatically, and so does economic life. And basically your whole life becomes very disruptive. And chaotic. And of course, everything begins to slow down and stop. especially when there's not a lot of fuel either to power public transportation, etc. So it's a very, very difficult situation without a doubt. There's always a positive and a negative, and so the positive is that finally, after being urged to do this for quite some time now, the Cuban government has taken two very important decisions. And they basically took them last summer, though a lot of it some hasn't even been announced and other parts have. So they decided to stop all new hotel construction, and they decided to go to begin a crash program to develop solar energy. And so they have a crash program, one of these mega programs that they do, where they put everything into the process, and they're hoping to, over the next couple of years, really put a big dent into their dependence on fuel. It's being, completely backed by the Chinese, but also by their own forces, because what happened is during the hotel construction, basically it was all, civilian military owned. And so basically a civilian military construction company teamed up with a French company called Bouygues, which is one of the largest construction companies in the world. It's like Halliburton. And they built all the hotels here. So they've stopped that now, kind of late, but they have stopped it. Bouygues has left, and they're putting those construction resources, mainly the manpower, the woman power, and the machinery, into this, solar development project. So you have the money coming in and the credits coming in and the equipment coming in from China, and you have the Cubans doing the work here and the Cuban military doing some of the work as well. So that gives it a chance of more or less happening, and they're hoping that it will. So that's the situation, but there's nothing nice about it. There's nothing nice to say about it, and it's a very, very difficult situation. And it comes with everything else that's also going on here, which is there's not a lot of food, for a certain part of the population, there's not a lot of food, medicine, or anything else. So all these things combined are making life extraordinarily difficult for maybe 40% of the population, and difficult for another 40%. And then maybe there's 20% who have the income to kind of escape most of it. And so that's the situation.
Actually, my second question was going to be about, with all the sunlight on Cuba and wind power, why weren't they, or were they, developing solar and wind? And obviously, from what you said, they are developing solar. And it's very heartening to hear that they're putting so much energy behind it to develop that in a short amount of time. And you mentioned that this was backed by the Chinese. Wanted to also see how much support are they getting from the EU or Canada in terms of energy and medicines.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the solar project is basically a Silk and Road project, and it's also a credit to China in terms of helping to develop alternative energy around the world. And it's possible that the EU and Canada will also participate, but in a very minor way. This is going to be mainly Chinese. At least at this point, that's what it is. It's Chinese development credits and equipment, 100%. And so basically that's what's going on. There's
Okay,
very little from anybody else.
in terms of medicines, are the Chinese helping in that? I mean, you said there's a shortage of medicines, and I remember that being true earlier as well. They have so many doctors, and they've really focused on medical research, where even Cuba has some drugs we don't have. So I wanted to find out more about the Chinese help on getting medicines. Is EU supporting in that any way whatsoever? And is the US embargo still preventing any medicines from coming from here?
Okay, well, there's three parts to that.
Yeah,
The whole world, I mean, most of the world, in different ways, does what it quote unquote can to help the Cubans in terms of medicine and in terms of healthcare, everybody's sending them medicine. Everybody's, doing what they can within limits, whatever those limits are. But it's not nearly enough, and there's a huge shortage here of medicines. I don't know anybody who can get the medicines they need here, basically at this point. It's a very, very serious problem, especially, when it comes to hospitals and the need for testing and everything else. This has been a problem now for a number of years, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. What's interesting about the relationship with the Chinese is that they have a very close relationship in terms of medical development, research and development, and also production in China sold to the Chinese. So there's 5 joint ventures between the Chinese and the Cubans in China, doing all kinds of things, including, they're selling some of their products that you can't get other places, like, curing diabetic ulcers or some of their cancer drugs. When the pandemic started in China, one of their joint ventures played a key role in providing a medicine that helped the whole breathing system to patients there. And they just recently actually opened a 100% Cuban research and development project in China as well. So the relationship is one that's not just like, we're giving you aspirin, but we're supporting your development and you're supporting us. It's a back and forth relationship that is very strong. It's been around for about 15, 20 years now. And some of these projects have been around that long, and some of them are newer. So that's the main, and that's very different from any other country. I mean, the Cubans do have a joint venture in Iran and a few other places, but mainly in China. And that's been there for a long, long time now.
Yeah, that's interesting to know. I wanted to ask you something else. Is there ways that organizations in the US can send medicines to Cuba? Is there any possibility for that?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways. You just have to decide, who you're going to send it with. Just look, I'm sure in California, there's lots of organizations doing it. And there's lots of national organizations. I don't really particularly remember their names, but they're easy to find out. But there's a coalition to end the embargo that also does a lot of, a national coalition to end the embargo that also does a lot of that type of work. You just have to find out the exact name of it. Code Pink sends lots of people send medicine all the time.
Great. That's good to know. And that's good for our audience to know.
Yeah, and then the United States reports it as if they're sending the medicine. It's like ridiculous. And then they don't send any medicine in the United States. And while it's true that in theory the Cubans can buy medicine from the United States, the fine print says that every single aspirin that has to be accounted for so that a soldier doesn't take it.
Oh.
So basically, commercially, it's impossible to do any kind of business around medicine with the Cubans.
Another type of embargo. And that's another thing I wanted to ask you. Have the sanctions in any way changed under the Biden administration, or is it pretty much the same as it's been before?
It kind of changed, like, this kind of like, we want peace in the Middle East, that never comes, and we're working for peace that never comes. Well, it's kind of the same thing, because what they did is they changed a few little tiny things, that were really not important or never really came into practice, even though they were changed into law. But basically, they kept the Trump administration's, policies, the Bolton, policies on Cuba, which remain today. I mean, one of the things is there's very little more that Trump can do because all his sanctions are still in place. And there's very little more sanctions available to the United States because every sanction you can think of is already in place. So they're going to be able to do some minor stuff, but most of it's already there. There's very little more they can do. They can try to like pursue the different sanctions more aggressively and that kind of thing, but we have a hard time thinking of what more in terms of really serious sanctions, not minor ones, they can put in place. The only thing we can think of is Marco Rubio and the people who are going to be in charge have always taken the position that there should be no contact between Cuba and Cuban Americans, let alone Americans. So they may try to cut further the flights, the remittances, that sort of thing. But internationally, there's very little more they can do than what they're already doing.
It's interesting to know. I know the Cuban emigre population, primarily in Florida, has been very instrumental in the policies that have been implemented in Washington regarding sanctions. Is it easier or harder for Americans to visit Cuba now?
It's a bit easier than it was under Trump, but not a lot. It's still very difficult. But they did loosen a little bit one of the rules in terms of travel that make it a little easier for people to come, but not much. It's still very difficult to come, and you have to have a lot of courage, and you really have to, by law, stay in private places because almost all hotels are sanctioned.
Really? Now
In
we can't.
theory, in theory, when you walk through Old Havana, you can't, buy anything, including, you can't, have your cards read or buy or anything because the entire place is sanctioned because in fact, Old Havana is run by a civilian military company.
Wow, this is interesting. When we were there, or I was there with the group in 2015, which was 9 years ago now, we did stay in one of those big hotels, and it seemed like we were able to stay in one or two hotels there. But we were told we were not supposed to walk on the beach. We were not supposed to walk alone through Havana. We were supposed to stay with our group tour. And I did walk alone. I left the tour one day, nothing happened. And I realized that um, we were allowed by the Cuban government, but not allowed by our government. As far as I know, we were not surveilled while we were there, but I don't know. So is it harder now for people who are traveling from the US than it was 9 years ago?
But you probably couldn't stay in those hotels anymore.
Really?
No, right.
So
They were all sanctioned under the Trump administration.
I did not know
And
that.
by, and by what Biden did is he didn't take those sanctions off, but what he did do is he didn't add new sanctions. So there are in fact now one or two new hotels that are actually run by Gaviota, which is a military tourism arm, which you can stay at. So that you could probably still stay at those hotels, and that's where all the Americans stay. They're all in one or two hotels
Hmm.
because the rest you can't stay in.
So are those in Havana?
They're in Havana, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm interested to know how you're feeling, I guess, what the relationship is between Cubans who have relatives in the US who are supporting the sanctions. They're actually hurting their relatives more than they're hurting the Cuban government. Do you hear anything about that odd situation?
Well, I mean, what can you say? I mean, it's not new. That's been going on for a long time. And the question, the majority of Cuban Americans have traditionally, you know, in polls, on the one hand, supported sanctions, but on the other hand, supported people that they have the right to go there and send money there and everything else. And it grew under Trump and it's remained high in this election. In Florida, it was like 67%, according to the polls, more or less. And so, the conversations that go on in the families, I'm not sure. There's an awful lot of families, so it's hard to say what they're talking about. I mean, the people I know, I know lots of new people. I mean, I just was in the States, and I won't go into the details. So right in the little place where I was staying there's a woman who just came through on parole, and there's a young man who actually came in on a visiting visa and stayed and never left. And they're both there, and they're not talking politics. They're basically trying to survive.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um, and then the older ones, I mean, one of the things that happens, unfortunately, is that people who immigrate can tend to think, well, more immigrants means more competition for me. So I'm not sure I would like that. And no, I'm serious. And so, just like say in Brazil, where Lula, brought millions of people out of poverty, and they tended to vote for for the other guy, because more people who got out of poverty, the more competition there would be for their new position in life. It's one of those sad things about human beings that happens a lot. And so, and so, in the
yeah.
case of immigrants, that can also happen.
So do you see any interference or propaganda coming from the US and social media or media in Cuba?
Constant. It's been constant. It's not. Can you see any? Can you see any that's not?
Really?
Yeah, of course. But it's always hard to tell how much is U.S. government's. You know, for example, the U.S. government broadcasts officially. Television, TV, everything else. Marti is called, and that's official propaganda from the United States that gets broadcast into Cuba and on social media and on Twitter and everything else. But then there's like 12 other platforms now or more, but there's at least 5 or 6 well-known platforms based outside the United States that are constantly um, agitating um, inside Cuba. Basically it's like, they're swift boating every single move anybody makes. They're just basically that type of attack, 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 attack. And so they're constantly attacking anything and everything that goes on here. And they never once mention U.S. policy or the embargo.
Hmm.
And that's constant. And there's thousands and thousands of memes, and there's really well done stuff. There's comics and everything else. And they're all very, very hostile to the government. And some of that is clearly, we know from what we know about how the US operates and other countries as well, that some of that is clearly backed by the United States, and some of it may not be. It may just be, groups of Cubans who, for their own reasons, have decided to do whatever they're doing. But there's a clear, there's very little doubt that since the advent of internet here, there's been many positive things about it, but one of the negative things is that the place is inundated with stuff day and night, and it's also inundated with fake news, and it's also inundated with whatever. So that's certainly, you got to remember, it's an interesting situation because that's one of the reasons, and it's not all negative, but the positive is it forces the government to be much more accountable
Hmm.
and much more transparent and much more quick on its feet. But it's a constant onslaught, a constant.
How do the majority of Cuban people see their government now? What's their feeling about it?
Well,
Positive,
I mean, you
negative?
know, again, it's always difficult to say because there are 10 million Cubans, and so it's hard to know what they're all thinking. Though I would assume like the Cuban government, U.S. government have a good idea because they just take the data or they monitor all Facebook through artificial intelligence, and they get not only a good grasp of what everybody's thinking, but how they're reacting to whatever policy or whatever things that they're doing on almost an instantaneous basis. But in my case, I don't have any of that money or resources. So here's what I would say. I've always kind of looked at it this way. There's 3 groups of people in Cuba. There's people who support the revolution. There's people who oppose the revolution. And there's people kind of in the middle who go kind of with the wind or whatever's going on at the moment. And historically, I would have said, I would have always said that, 60% of the population supports the revolution, more or less. 20% oppose and 20 float.
Mhm.
But that's no longer the case at all. After these 30 years of crisis here or whatever, I would say that maybe there's 30% that support the revolution, 30% that actively oppose it, and 40% that still kind of wiggle around there in the middle. A very different political situation from what it was. And that's because, you know, the government has not been able to. There's three reasons for that, right? One is there's no more Fidel Castro. Okay, and that's a very important reason. The second reason is that there's internet for the first time. It really only came to Cuba en masse in 2019, right? And the third reason is that the government's made some visible mistakes that have not helped the situation. So all those things have led to a kind of a different kind of political situation.
Yeah, there was no internet when we were there in 2015 and 2016. So I can see the difference from what you're talking about. They didn't have this onslaught of information coming from the US or other places. It just wasn't in the social media. Social media
And
didn't.
people are very susceptible to it because it's new.
Right.
I mean, I have a friend, for example, who is an older guy, a bit younger than me, but not much. And so he comes over to my house, because I have Wi-Fi here, and he's been coming here for years, and he looks at his cell phone, and basically what he does is, he uses it to chat with family, and he's like a handyman. He uses it to learn his trade, and he also likes to look at young women in bathing suits, but in full bathing suits, not bikinis or anything. And what can I tell you? He likes to do that. I always tell him, why doesn't he just go to the beach? And he goes, no, because I don't want to offend anybody. But so anyhow, about 2 years ago or so, he started showing me these memes of the government here. These attack films and comics and everything else. And I said, wow, that's new. How did that happen? And he said, well, one day I somehow got one and I hit the button, I sent it to somebody. And since then, my feed just fills up with these things all the time. And a lot of them are really funny, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah,
So,
people
you
engaged.
try to tell them, well, there's some messaging going on here, pal. And no, no, come on. And so, people are a bit naive here, lots of people in terms of, as they are in the United States, apparently still,
Right.
but naive in terms of that stuff. And they get very attracted because a lot of them are very well done.
Right. Yeah,
So,
that's unfortunate. I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience now. And when I call on you, you can unmute. Otherwise, please stay muted because of background noise. And it's easiest for me to see if you use the automatic hand raise, but I'll look around to see if I see people raising their hands. So I can call on you. I don't see anybody yet. Um, If you don't, I'll continue to ask questions until I see somebody. Okay, Mike, unmute Mike.
Yes, of course. Hi. Yeah, I just wrote a couple things down. It's all very interesting. I was curious about, first I was going to just ask you about I guess the danger. You're talking about walking alone. I mean, how I mean, somebody can't just go out at night and walk around, like you said, Georgia, did you afraid to walk alone? Or is it very, risky or violent? But the other thing I want to ask you is how many people actually, I'm just kind of curious, say 10 million people in Cuba, like yourself, actually left the United States, I'm assuming forever, You're not coming back. I don't know if you are, and just went and lived there. And how are they treated there? You're not Cuban, you're American, or maybe you're Cuban now. I don't know actually, but I'm just saying, how many people actually would do that and decide I want to live in Cuba for the rest of my life? I'm just really curious about that.
Let me answer the first part first, because no, I wasn't supposed to walk alone, not because there was anything to be afraid of. It's very safe. It was because of the US policy. Americans were not allowed by our government to walk on the beaches there, to walk around town by ourselves. That came from our government. Nothing was fearful in Cuba.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, so now the rest for you, Mark.
Okay, so first question. Obviously, in terms of safety, in a crisis like this, of course, the security question is real. I know there's more kind of there's more street crime going on than there used to go on, but it's still minor compared to the United States. So in most of Cuba, people still walk around at night and women still walk around at night and nothing happens. But for the Cubans, any kind of increase in crime is like a big deal. So it's a big scandal here that there is an increase in crime, that people's phones are being stolen, that people's motorcycles are being stolen, that there are some gangs, especially in Eastern Cuba. They're not gangs like in most of Latin America, but they do exist, and they're fighting between themselves, and once in a while a young person gets killed. So I would say that the security situation has deteriorated, but it's still fairly good. I recommend at night, and I have for a long time, for people, to keep their eyes open. My wife, who's a nurse here, back in the 90s, when she worked in a clinic for foreigners, and they had tourists coming in all the time, would, kids had ridden by in bicycles and grabbed their camera and knocked them over, and they broke their arm. This kind of stuff has always gone on in Cuba. Cuba is not paradise, but in general, crime here is still, I would say, fairly well controlled, at least in Havana. And I would probably guess even more so in some rural towns, and less so maybe in Santiago, which has had real problems with lights now for 3 years. So I would say, sure, be smart, don't walk around at night alone, walk with other people. The odds of anything like what you would run into in any other Latin American country are pretty much zero, but always possible. In terms of people who are here, no, I'm actually probably going to retire to Orlando to be with my kid and grandkids. That's what I probably will do. There's not a lot of Americans here who have come here to live here. It's a very small community of foreigners here. There's not a lot of foreigners who, as far as I can tell, who live here, plan to live here till they retire, or that kind of stuff, or live here until they die. I don't think there's a lot. It's not almost not worth a story, because it's such a small amount of people. I was raised, I mean, it used to be maybe there's 50, 100 people here from the United States. Then I saw some statistics going up to the year 2000 where that had increased to, hundreds more. I've never seen them. I don't know where they are. They're wherever they are, doing whatever they're doing. I have no idea. But there's not a lot of people.
Okay, Linda has her hand up. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So this is a pretty basic question, but I mean, what does the United States government demand of Cuba to lift the sanctions? I mean, what is it that we're trying to do with all of these sanctions, given that we make life so difficult for Cuba? I just don't get it after all these years.
I'll explain it very simply, okay? United States is, what's known and academia has a core society, and the biggest, most powerful core ever. Other people call them empires, right? And a lot of times they're called cores. And Cuba, if you look at it in a historic perspective over thousands of years, because there's been cores in every culture and society throughout history. Thousands and thousands of years ago, there were cores, in China. So basically, Cuba, right on our doorstep, is basically province, a client state of that core. Okay, just like cores throughout history have client states around them and further out. It's a very normal historic process. And that client state rebelled against the core and rebelled in a hemisphere that the core felt was its sphere of influence, as in the Monroe Doctrine. And when a rebel province historically, rebels against a core, they get squashed every single time. There's only one example in history where a rebel province so close to a core survived at all. And so basically all that's really taking place between the United States and Cuba is that the United States wants to use Cuba as an example and also to bring it back into its sphere of influence and for it to become a client state again. There's nothing complicated about it. It's very normal throughout history. It's not even personal. It's how cores, organically act, and so in my opinion, what the United States wants is for Cuba to surrender on its knees and then rejoin our sphere of influence, which is a perfectly normal thing for a core to want, believe it or not. And so I think that's all there is to that story in the end. So then you want to get into all the fine detail and everything else. So that would be my honest answer to you in terms of what's going on between the two countries. And, it's remarkable that Cuba has survived as long as it has as a rebel province.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. And I was thinking, back in the early days when Cuba, right after the revolution, threw out Standard Oil and those companies that were exploiting their resources. So one of the things, of course, the U.S. would want would be our corporations to go back into Cuba. So I see that Ben has his hand up. Do you want to ask something, Ben?
Yeah, well, I want to first of all amplify what Mark is saying about that. The relationship is between a rebellious peripheral country, which is in the sphere of influence of our empire, and I've been my entire life I've known people who have almost made a career out of going back and forth to Cuba and kind of always talking about the question. And that's 50 years of my adult life or plus. They have continued to find more ways to sanction it. It's pretty clear that we're George Floyding Cuba. The empire is going to stand on its windpipe until they submit. And I don't know, that's a pretty black-pilled view, but is that shared in Cuba?
Yes, I mean that's the Cuban position is that what I said is actually the Cuban position. I don't take it because it is their position. I take it because it's obvious. But yes, basically their position is exactly that, and they say that's why Biden didn't change Trump's policy because it's not a matter of parties. It's a matter of something much more fundamental.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't say it like I say it. They just say the big bad United States, wants to kill us or drag us back in and stuff. They don't put it in all the, academic way I did. I guess I don't think I'm an academic, but that's how the academics talk about it. But sure, their position is, the Cuban position is, they're going to keep fighting, they're going to keep trying. But, basically don't count on the U.S., changing its policy.
not unless we can get Bernie as president. Again, before I go to Peter who has a question, I want to mention Mark's book, Cuban Revelations, because a lot of the history, a lot of the reasons, and a lot of the answers to some of the questions today are in this book. It's really quite extraordinary. So I would highly recommend it. It's still in print and you can get it. So Peter, go ahead. Want to unmute? There we go.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for sharing your time with us.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, a couple of questions. I was just kind of interested in how much help is China giving with the solar and renewables? I know like 20 years ago, there was a big influx of like Chinese railroad locomotives and things like that. And then I didn't hear much more about that kind of strategic investment. This sounds like a whole new thing with this energy cooperation. Could you tell us a little more?
Yeah, I think what you said is correct. I mean, China, a lot of noise is made about the fact, and it is a fact, the Chinese trade with Cuba has declined over the last 10 years. And that's because Cuba didn't pay its bills and didn't pay its credits, and that's how China works. But at the same time that happened, and China also does not have a lot of joint ventures in Cuba. But what China does in Cuba is fund very important projects, especially infrastructure projects in Cuba. So they funded a new container terminal port in Santiago. They funded a new floating dry dock in Havana that just opened to repair ships. They funded and supplied equipment for most of the communications that exist in Cuba today. They are now clearly funding a very strategic project, which is the solar energy project, which we still have very few details on. We're still trying to gather the details. It's not like they're telling us how much or anything like that, but it's very clear from what we're seeing and what's going on. And so that's kind of what China's done. And yeah, there was a period where they sent them a lot of transportation equipment. There's a lot of Chinese buses here. There's some locomotives, things like that. But again, that was just kind of almost momentary, a certain peak in trade. Basically, while Fidel was still around, and that's declined since then. But the rest of it has not declined. So I think it's a mistake when you read stories like one that was put up by my agency that I had nothing to do with, or I think it was by someone. No, I think it was put out by it was put up by somebody else saying that the Chinese and the Cubans are at loggerheads because look at Chinese trade. It's not really that simple. So basically, it seems to me that they continue to give very important support to the Cubans in very important projects.
It almost seems like they've taken the place of the USSR in the old days. I wanted to ask about organic agriculture, because when we went there in 2015 and 16, a lot of the farms that we saw, small family farms, were organic. And I've read something about more pesticides being brought into the country, and I wondered if you know anything about that.
Sure, I do. According to the agriculture minister, they've gotten almost no fertilizer or pesticides for the last 5 years in Cuba, in just a very recent interview. And basically, it's all the food you're eating here now is organic, basically, compared to most places.
Wow.
Not because they want it that way, it's because they can't afford to buy the pesticides and fertilizer. And so that's certainly the case today. There's very little fertilizer, there's very little pesticides, there's very little there's very little of that around right now, period, except for of course, they imports, 70% of the food they eat. But But when it comes to vegetables and fruits and stuff like that, it couldn't be more organic.
So it's, so it
Right,
was.
right now, in general, even though they would rather that it wasn't, it's the way it is, and they've developed their own pesticides and their own organic fertilizer and all these things to try to compensate as much as they can for the fact that they simply can't afford anymore to import that stuff. And then on top of that, of course, there's a whole bunch of like really interesting kind of, I would call, either private or pilot, both really private and pilot farm projects in Cuba that are organic, but kind of state of the art with like real science being put into the work. Some real, real serious thought being put into the farming. And they've done very well here, actually, in terms of being able to develop quite interesting production. It hasn't gone mass at this point at all, but it's certainly there, and it's very, very interesting.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting to hear that it's still, there's a lot of organic food there. When we were there, our tour took us to a place, I think it was called Las Teresas or something. It was in the hills.
Gracias.
Yeah, and there was actually a vegetarian restaurant in there that they took us to, but it was an incredible place. There were about 3,000 people that lived there, and it was created, I think, as a safe place in case Cuba was attacked. Can you tell us anything about that settlement there? It was quite fascinating.
It just got wrecked by the hurricane.
Oh, no.
I hate to bring you bad news, yes. But so it's a very interesting project, and it's been around for a long time. It was one of the first kind of ecotourism projects developed by Cuba way back in the 90s, I think. And it's like kind of close to Havana. And it's kind of, that whole area is kind of a protected area, and there's lots of interesting things you can do, etc.
Yeah, it was fascinating going there. I wanted to ask one last thing, and if there's any other questions. Oh, yeah, there is. Okay, Peter, just after I ask this, is there an American embassy or consulate in Cuba at all, or is that long gone?
No, 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 of course there is. In fact, under Obama, there's always, since 1987, under Carter, there's been a U.S. interest section in Cuba, which is basically our embassy, but under the Swiss at the time, and involved in consular services and everything else, like most of the functions that an embassy does. And that's existed both in the United States with the Cubans in Washington and with us in Havana since 1987. And under Obama, of course, that changed and they became embassies. By Swiss, same building, same everything, and on both sides, right? In Cuba and in Washington. Under Trump, he did not close the embassies, though he would have liked to. But he basically, using this whole thing of the sonic attacks, if you remember that period, basically, cut staff to like as low as he could on both sides, because once they cut it here in Cuba, once the U.S. cut staff here, reciprocity, they kicked everybody out in Washington, and it got down to a skeleton staff in both places, but it's still embassies, even though the Republicans refused to support an ambassador, right? They blocked an ambassador. So it's an embassy run by the charge d'affaires, and it still exists here in Cuba today. And it's back to more or less full functioning at this point. So that's one thing Biden did do. He brought that embassy back to full functioning.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'm going to take a last question from Peter. You want to unmute, Peter? You are mute. Doesn't seem to know how to unmute.
Um,
There we go.
yeah, just following up on the economic stuff. I read that Cuba is now in some way a part of that BRICS um, collection of grouping of global South countries. How significant do you think that is? Is that going to help them very much?
Well, yeah, they're not a member of BRICS. They're just an associate or whatever it is. It's a secondary, it's like an observer almost, but a little bit more than an observer. Well, that depends on what you think of BRICS, right? And where you think they're going in the future. Um, so I don't think in the short term it's going to do much one way or the other for Cuba. But in the medium and long term, it might be very helpful for Cuba to the extent to which they are successful in what they want to do, which is basically challenge Western hegemony over international finance and trade.
Okay.
And so in the short term, I don't think they're going to get a lot out of it, but or be able to give a lot either. But we'll have to see. They're very good at their diplomacy, and it's certainly along it's something that they would want to be part of for their own reasons, clearly. And it was so basically that's what I would say about it. But I think it's too soon to tell what it really means, because BRICS itself is still in its infancy in terms of what it can accomplish. So we'll have to see where it goes,
Right. I don't think we have any other questions. I don't see any. So I want to know, Mark, if you want to say any last few things that haven't been asked that you'd like us to know about.
Not really. I think that the one thing I would say is that the image that all is disaster in Cuba and it's almost already a failed state and about to fall, which is what the position will be clearly of the Trump administration and whatever it does, is not really accurate. It's a very difficult situation in Cuba, but clearly, like them or not, the Cuban state is still fairly strong and is not about to disappear anytime soon or blow itself up or anything else. So what you're going to probably see is just them hunkering down over the next 4 years and then doing whatever they can, like with the BRICS and everybody else in the world, to survive whatever gets thrown at them over the next 4 years. So it's unfortunate. It's certainly going to be painful for everybody concerned, but I would probably forecast that they probably will survive it, and then we'll have to see what happens after that. But that's the only thing I would say, because I've been kind of like looking at that a lot, just because if you read what's out there in the media, you would assume that tomorrow, just like we've read many times before, but like tomorrow is going to go. And I'm not convinced of that from what I see.
Great. If you have a short question, I'll let you ask it if you can contain it. Great. Yes.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep the volcano in the plasma container here. Yeah, I would just add that for the long-term prospects for Cuba, that the development of BRICS might be a route out of their pariah status, because, like Georgia was saying, that you couldn't use their credit card there because they're precluded from the international, SWIFT international system. The war on Russia really has broken that down. China and Russia have stepped in and realized, okay, we're not going to let the United States government basically steal, as they did with Russia, $300 billion out of U.S. controlled accounts. Nobody wants their money where the U.S. can use that as a sanction against them. So I think that this may help alleviate the BRICS over time. Having this alternative financial system in the world will give Cuba greater access to credit and resources and more like a normal economy. Because the United States empire, since I have been conscious, has been trying to create a failed state in Cuba. That's their goal, is to make the state fail. If they can't, then they'll just stunt it and immiserate it. And, I don't think, I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
Well, we don't want to end on that now, even though it's true. Anyway, do you have any comment on that, Mark?
No, I mean, I don't really have a comment on it. Yeah, I think more or less it's true. I don't, I have no comment on it. I think it's well put.
Yeah, I think we probably all see that. So I want to thank you so much, Mark, for being with us again. This has really been a wonderful hour. And I think, I was telling or talking to Mark about it earlier, is the first time he was ever on Zoom was for a Praxis program. So we've made that connection through to Cuba with Mark, which I'm most appreciative, and our ongoing friendship too. So we see some people applauding. So thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate it.
It's always really, we're such nice people. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, really. So.
That's nice to hear. I'm going to send you a recording of this tonight, and to everybody on the call and those who couldn't make it live. I'm going to end the recording now, but you don't have to leave yet, anyone. Oops.